Swinson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Benton, and it's a great pleasure to follow the Honourable Gentleman for Lancaster and Wye, who's got a great deal of expertise on this issue, and I'm sure we all enjoyed his remarks. It's also great to be here discussing this today, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Ilford South, both for the way in which he introduced the debate and indeed for the work of his committee in producing this report, which is a well-researched and thorough document. And I think that it has led to us having a very lively and important debate here this afternoon. I think, unfortunately, it is 18 months nearly after the report was published, and while it would have been, I'm sure, helpful to have been able to debate this report earlier, it's actually sad to say that many of the same issues are still with us and many of the same conclusions do indeed apply. As a main thrust of what the report is suggesting, I think paragraph 109 is particularly salient in its recommendation, when it basically says that there needs to be a wholesale recasting of its relationship with the international community, particularly with the United States and the European Union. And I think we all felt a great sense of elation when President Obama was elected, and indeed in his first foreign policy moves seemed, and indeed still seems to be very much pursuing a path which is more positive on the world stage and very much extending that open hand. And I think, therefore, the recommendation of the Select Committee is one which the international community is effectively now following that path. But unfortunately, the response so far is not encouraging, to say the least. But in general, I am minded to think that is still the correct approach, and it must be given a chance to work. And indeed, the comments of President Obama and Joe Biden in restating that intention recently is very welcome indeed. Obviously, the most important event in the context of Iran recently is the election, which we've heard a lot about during this debate. I would very much agree with the government's position that the will of the Iranian people should be upheld, just as in any democracy the will of the people should be upheld. And I was just as critical of the first election of President Bush for the will of the American people, in my view, being usurped. There's certainly serious questions about the election that's taken place. I was very interested to hear the comments of the Honourable Member for Thurrock, indeed, rightly pointing out the problems that half the population were ineligible to stand as candidates for the presidency, which certainly is something which I don't think is welcome in any country, to have that kind of discrimination against women. But it's clear that, regardless of what we in the UK would say about that election, that many Iranians want answers, and they are the people that matter the most in this process, because they're the ones who have had the right to go and cast a vote and should have the opportunity to make sure that the votes that they have cast have been counted correctly. We've all seen the protests on the television, on YouTube, followed them online on various internet sites, and regardless of who won the election or what we think about the election, just the very violence we've seen on our screens has to be a cause for great concern. It's been absolutely horrendous, and it's been wonderful in a sense that there has been this empowerment of citizens to be able to report the news themselves through a variety of mobile technologies, and that has enabled a lot of communication. But at the same time, obviously, that has put very many disturbing images into the public domain. But I have to say, I in general think it is positive anywhere in the world to see people being empowered by that kind of new technology, and that is to be welcomed. I think it's too early to say where we are with this post-election situation. There are reports that even today there may be more protests as the 10th anniversary of the crackdown on the student protests. But Professor Ali Ansari, who gave evidence, obviously, to the Select Committee, was this week quoted in the Times as saying, "This is nowhere near resolved." And as an esteemed expert on the issue of Iran, I suspect he is right, and it's very difficult to call exactly what will happen, and we will have to watch as that does unfold, with the one exception, I would say, of obviously where there are the members of the British staff in Iran, particularly the foreign national British staff, that we are making strong recommendations to have the final individual released, because clearly that's unacceptable, and it's obviously right that the government is pursuing that with all haste that it can. I was very taken by the analysis of the election by the honourable member who just spoke from Lancaster, and why. Because there has been a sort of reaction in the UK to seeing, protesters and apparent people, rallying around a reform cause. And because of that news story about the protests, there hasn't really been the same always analysis alongside it of what were actually the policies of these different presidential candidates. And of course, it's quite right to say that what we might perceive as reform is not necessarily what was even on offer from Mousavi in Iran. So there was not this great choice of reform. All of the candidates did have to be approved in advance by the existing structures within Iran. And it's true, certainly, whatever the outcome of the election was going to be, that the nuclear issue was not going to go away, because, again, that was something where, amongst the various candidates, there was a consensus. And so, while the election is something which is obviously a very recent development that we need to be watching, the bigger issues were always going to remain, and indeed the nuclear issue is obviously one of the hugest foreign policy challenges that I think the whole world is facing at the moment. The Honourable Member for Birmingham Edgbaston said that the regime acts in a pretty rational way, and I think it's a very good analysis, because from the Iranians' point of view, if you put yourself in their shoes, you can see that there are many reasons why they would pursue having a nuclear weapon and having that capability. They obviously, within the region, they have a nuclear-armed Israel, and there's certainly no love lost between those two states. There's the whole status issue and the desire to be seen as a world player, and indeed, perhaps less so now with the Obama regime, but with when Bush was in power in America, certainly a very sometimes real prospect of a possible American invasion, especially when they look to see what happened in Iraq. So we need to recognise that reality and understand it if we're to have any chance of preventing the danger which we all do want to prevent. Because the update was very welcome from the chair of the Select Committee that subsequent to this particular report, there's been a further report on proliferation, and it is very worrying to see that states that there's been rapid progress towards further enrichment and expansion of centrifuges. And obviously we don't know exactly at what stage that's at and how many months or years they are away from acquiring the capability to be a nuclear state, but that is clearly the huge danger. And as the report points out, this could have a domino effect within the region. There's already heightened tensions, but when you start to think about the next steps, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, in a sense it really doesn't bear thinking about, because the potential disasters that could happen are immense when you think about other Middle East states wanting to acquire nuclear weapons. And in the broader context of all of us wanting to stop proliferation and to reduce the nuclear capabilities across the entire globe, then it's clearly very worrying indeed. I would say actually that I think we don't do ourselves any favours sometimes with our own position on Trident, having sort of committed as a country to replacing Trident, and to do that when actually there's no need to make that decision at this time, given the current lifespan of the Trident submarines that we have. And to do that just before you go to the 2010 non-proliferation conference, to me just seems very bizarre, because surely you want to go to that conference and to be able to negotiate and to be able to say that that our nuclear weapons are on the table. Certainly give way to the Minister.
Can I just say to the Honourable Lady, she wouldn't want to give any impression from this debate internationally that there is an equivalence between British foreign policy in any respect and the actions of the Iranian government. I think it would be extremely damaging, and I'm sure the Honourable Lady is not trying to do that, but I really think it's important that is clear from this debate.
Well, I don't think for a second that I was making that link. The link I am making is that in discussions in non-proliferation talks around the world, our position surely is stronger if we are prepared to talk about reducing our own nuclear weapons. That gives us a much better power in negotiation. And I think this is in the case of Iran, but any other countries that are thinking of going nuclear. Surely, if it looks like the main current nuclear players are reducing their arsenal, then that actually reduces the pressure for other countries to go nuclear and try to join the club, as it were. And indeed, I think we have seen the success of that type of strategy from President Obama by actually putting American nuclear weapons, as it were, on the table in the discussions with Russia. In a sense, the best use that you can possibly have for a nuclear weapon is surely to use it to negotiate away other nuclear weapons, and that is the only way that they can be used in a positive way. I think the question was well posed by the Honourable Member for Lancaster and White. What do we do? We can discuss the problems, we can say the difficulties, but what are the real options? And the military option is one which I note the committee has said that we remain of the view that such a military strike would be unlikely to succeed and could provoke an extremely violent backlash across the region. And I would very much agree with that concern, because I think that it would be a very dangerous road to go down. And I'm pleased that the Foreign Secretary has said that he's 100% behind the diplomatic track, though I do know that the government hasn't entirely ruled out any possible support for a future military strike by the US. But I think that would be very, very dangerous territory that we just don't want to go down. It would actually strengthen the extremists, and I don't think it's the right way forward. So then you look at the sanctions regime, which, as has been well discussed, is currently not working well. And, of course, a united approach between the E3+3 is vital to that, and that currently is not as united as we might want it to be in terms of the loopholes that exist. And we must be, I suppose, continuing and increasing our efforts to encourage those other countries, such as Russia and China, to recognise the threat and to play ball, to borrow a phrase. And as I say, there is good news in terms of Obama's overtures to Russia, that he is offering to scrap the Son of Star Wars project if the Russians will help in halting the proliferation in terms of Iran. And Russia is a key player, and it would be really great if we could get their help to get Iran negotiating and hopefully try to make some progress. We have to accept that the UK's influence in this matter is not perhaps at its peak with the current diplomatic situation. So looking to what other countries might be able to bring some influence to bear, I think, is one of the ways that our influence could perhaps be best used. Turning to the issue of Iraq and Afghanistan, and particularly the Right Honourable Member for Tonbridge and Malling talked about the government's analysis on the training and support that's been given, particularly from Iran to insurgents and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And I mean, obviously this is a cause for great concern. And I know from the reports that there was correspondence which was unable to be published in the public domain for very understandable security reasons, in addition to what the government was able to say publicly. And so obviously I'm sort of intrigued to hear whether or not the committee is satisfied with the government's responses. It's rather difficult for those of us who haven't seen that correspondence to be able to judge. I suppose in general terms, I would say there's obviously a delicate balance to be struck, and where there's security concerns, clearly those have to come first. But where possible, if the government can try as much as it can to put the information in the public domain, I think that would be helpful. I will touch only briefly on human rights, Mr. Benton, because we did have an excellent debate on that yesterday here. And the report does conclude that Iran's human rights record is shocking, which we heard in detail yesterday, whether it's in religions with the Baha'i, the Christians, the Jews, the persecution of, and discrimination against women for all sorts of various types of perfectly reasonable behaviour, the types of persecution of anybody who disagrees politically with the prevailing views, and of course the horrendous situation where you have a state that is actually executing minors. So there are obviously a whole range of human rights problems. We didn't have a lot of time yesterday to go into the detail about the issue of gay and lesbian Iranians being deported from the UK to Iran, and I would be interested to hear the Minister's views on that when he responds today. In June 2008, the Home Secretary said there was no real risk to homosexuals who were deported to Iran if they behaved discreetly. I have to say, personally, I think that the suggestion that it's fine for somebody to be deported somewhere as long as they have to hide a pretty key aspect of themselves to avoid being tortured doesn't exactly fit with my sort of judgment of what's appropriate. The Home Office guidance apparently says that it is not accepted that there is systematic repression of gay men and lesbians in Iran. Well, I would just put it to the Minister that since 1979 there have been 4,000 state executions of people for being gay, and if that is not systematic repression, then I really don't know what is. So in summary, Mr Benton, I do look forward to the Minister's conclusions on the whole issue. It is a very difficult issue and a sensitive issue. I obviously, like everyone else, await the outcome of the current unrest and what will happen in Iran. But I would also note remarks made both by honourable members and in evidence to the Select Committee by the academic Karim Sajjapur, who said, despite the fact that a seeming majority of Iranians favour a more tolerant democratic system, there is little evidence to suggest that in the event of a sudden uprising it would be Iranian Democrats who come to power. I think we all need to bear that in mind when we're looking at what's happening on our television screens. The future is clearly currently uncertain, but with extreme dangers of nuclear proliferation and escalation of regional tensions. But I still nonetheless maintain the correct way forward must still be diplomacy, extending that open hand, and I do hope that this approach can be successful.